Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this episode of the Surge Ahead podcast. I'm Dr. Shanna Katz, your host-ex with the most-ex, and as always, I'm delighted to have you join us as we share our research, teaching, and praxis experiences when it comes to sexuality, relationships, and gender. Today's guest is Cat Hadley, who uses she/they pronouns. Cat is a co-founder of Restrict, a Detroit-based multimedia platform celebrating kink and queerness as political resistance. Through film festivals, magazines, and community events, Restrict platforms work that has been censored or suppressed. In a moment when pleasure is criminalized and queer and trans bodies are under attack, Restrict insists on the radical right to desire, autonomy, and existence on your own terms. Cat is a campaign strategist, a Truman Scholar, a New Leaders Council Fellow, and an elected Ann Arbor District Library Board Trustee. Also, dear listeners, Cat is currently one of my Masters of Social Work students, as well as a member of the SRG Collective, and I am delighted for all of us to get to learn more from them today. So, Cat, welcome. I've gotten to know a bit about you through connecting, through our class time, etc., but our listeners are totally new to you and your work. So will you tell us a little bit about how you came to do what you do?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me and the great intro. I made my way into organizing in kind of a weird route. I actually was a high school dropout, two-time beauty school dropout as well, just to name it. And I grew up.
You've got me wanting to sing some Grease songs over here.
I know. Yeah, it's true. I like to always mention that, like in tandem with the Truman thing, to just kind of keep it humble. But so I spent a long time in kind of the punk scene and making music and working minimum wage jobs. And, throughout that, I was lucky in that I was in that scene that kind of involved a lot of like questioning authority and like a critical eye towards the government. And it was also like toxic in other ways, but that's okay. But I learned a lot from that. I got to travel a lot and just like really lived my life. And then when I got a little bit older, I had some stability and was able to go back to school and got into writing for the newspaper at the community college. And I covered local politics because somebody had to do it. And kind of just started looking at these systems that harmed us and sometimes the lack of will to change them. And so I just kind of was like pulling on a thread for years. And, I went the kind of like extreme normie route, as I would say. I like cleaned up my act and I had 2 kids and just was in this phase of kind of denying a lot of who I was previously. It's that weird thing that happens in your life where the thing that you were ashamed of, like dropping out or these things, become a really marketable part. But the exchange in that is that now you're this like better version, whatever that means. And so I worked in politics for a long time. I went to U of M, I studied political science. I became a Truman Scholar. I worked on stuff from like food stamp expansion in the state, local issues. And then federally, I worked in economics on tax policy, trying to tax the super rich and raise the minimum wage. And I think that for me, there was a point, we were doing a lobby day the Monday after the election. And it was the realization.
Which election?
Oh, sorry, the last election where Donald Trump was elected again. So it was a little bit like attending a funeral. And I realized that I wanted to be doing the work that I wanted to be doing and working on queer liberation more than anything else. So I also just felt like, as somebody that's just was keeping an eye on things and talking to people in the halls, like censorship just kept coming up. And I started to get more and more worried about it. And it always feels like, and we've talked about this, like oftentimes the people in sex work, queer folks, are used as like the canary in the coal mine. They're going to see what they can get away with there and then expand to everyone else. And so I had always wanted to do a film festival. There are other film festivals around that do kind of a similar thing, but I wanted like this to be extremely queer and different and have different bodies and different representations there and have it be more of a conversation about like why that matters. And so we did that last year. We sold out. It was great. We're going to be back October 3rd this year. And we also expanded to a magazine because we were lucky in that last year we were able to have Free Speech Coalition, which is a really great work. They're doing work around like representing the sex industry. And they actually fought a Supreme Court case about censorship. And they do great work. They came and they talked about what they're doing and how to get involved, different things like that. So yeah, and then we realized we wanted to have more of this conversation, but through a magazine. And my thinking always through that is like, I know that for me, I feel like sometimes opening social media is like drinking from a fire hose. And so if there's a way to have these conversations or entertain these thoughts by something I can just like pick up and then put down is something that I just kind of wanted for us as we move forward. So that was kind of my meandering journey to where I am now. And I'm very happy to not be working on the Hill anymore, and just working on trying to create, queer spaces and queer joy and awareness.
Yeah, I mean, and I think there's a need for all folks in all spaces, but it doesn't have to be the same folks in the same spaces all the time, right? And so doing what you need to do to take care of yourself in between or, as you transition in those phases is it takes a certain type of person to be able to work, both at the state level and federally, and to keep doing that work even in the face of this. And we also need to take turns with who's doing that so that you can come back and really get refueled by community.
Yeah.
I love what you say about canary in the coal mine. I don't know if you've ever seen this tattoo. I'm going to describe it for our listeners, but it's a little canary and it's in this it looks like almost a steampunk box with an oxygen chamber, but it's real. This is a thing that, most miners, the canaries, the people that alert, pass away, because of danger. However, um, in some areas, they actually made these little oxygen chambers for the birds. So they'd hang out in them. And as soon as they started cheeping, they'd close the door and the oxygen would kick in. And so the canaries would survive. And I really, during these times, I got this because I was like, we're sounding the alarm, right? The queer and trans communities, sex workers, immigrants, all of us who are, experiencing some of these big impacts. Like, we can't give up because we got to keep fighting back, which leads us in to, I guess, kind of I'm not going to say meat because we all had a conversation about vegetarianism and veganism. So maybe the tofu or tempeh, if you will, the beyond, which is not my favorite, but it is something of today's talk. I want to talk censorship, if they even allow us to do that, which is kind of a joke, but also not given the shadow banning and other things that are happening to folks that talk on topics that we cover on this show. So I'm someone that's been online for almost 30 years now, and the censorship we are seeing is just beyond anything I've ever seen before. So I'm wondering if you can give us a rundown on what's been happening recently and why it's increasing so much as of late.
Yeah. You know, since probably, I mean, I think for a long time it's happening, but the FOSTA SESTA was kind of the kickoff of everything. And I know you talked about that, but they basically made a federal law that said, platforms can't facilitate sex trafficking, things like this. And I would just say to start the conversation off as somebody that worked in this area for a long time, when you have bills that are playing to emotional heartstrings, when you have things like this is for the children or this is that, I think it's worth interrogating what that really means because often it involves censorship and it's usually not very well thought out. Another thing to know that I just try to tell people, because I don't think it's as common knowledge, is that oftentimes lobbying groups, their main thing is to come in with a bill already written and try to get people to sign on to that bill. And they might do minor edits and they try to get things through, but a lot of times At my previous work, we would do this with, trying to tax the rich. We'd get somebody to sign on. So, often, sometimes when you press your representatives on these bills, they actually don't know because they didn't write this. So I just think in general, that's good information to have sometimes when you're having these conversations, which you should. You should talk to your reps. It's important, even though it's hard and it can feel like it's kind of yelling at nothing. But yeah, so we had FOSTA SESTA and
I'm going to pause for a
yeah.
second and just give so SESTA was the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act, and FOSTA was the Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act. So if you're not familiar with those are bills that were passed in 2018, supposedly with the idea that it was going to stop sex trafficking. And these came with a lot of unintended consequences, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Yeah. Well, I think, and the one that came from that, I think most directly that a lot of people have interacted with was the Tumblr adult content ban, which happened that year. And that was the company reacting to seeing these laws. And they banned adult content, but they also became a really early example of like what content is deemed adult. So those disproportionately affected queer folks, trans folks, artists, and sexual expression communities. And that ban still remains in place.
And basically killed Tumblr.
Yes, exactly. And then that also was followed with the OnlyFans crisis. And that is because you can think of censorship in bills, but also in policies for companies, because that was more of Visa, MasterCard, those companies, they control what you can buy with your own money, with your card. And if you look at their terms, it's actually really interesting. There's some stuff on there that's like anything with tentacles. There's like a weird list.
Because it's always affected sex work, right? And so
Yeah.
this is actually, there are some companies that are for streaming, which is billed through Visa and MasterCard, can't put certain things on their site that they can on DVDs, and conversely, can't put certain things on their DVDs that they can on the site. And one example I can give is menstruation,
Mhm.
right? Is that you can't have penetration and menstruation in the same scene and have it billed through Visa and MasterCard. And
Yeah.
so a lot of these companies, if you've noticed, even if you're into that type of thing, you can almost never find menstruation porn.
Mhm.
And it's also, you'd think, like with queer porn, like of course you would show menstruation. That's part of, some queer people fuck while
Yeah.
they menstruate. I mean, everybody fucks while they menstruate or can. But the reason you never see it is because the billers, not because the any laws or because of the comfort of the companies.
Yeah. And it's worth knowing also too, that this has these ricochet effects across communities. And just even in representation and seeing yourself represented in porn, which I do think is a really powerful experience to have. As somebody that's like been in like a mid-sized plus size body my whole life, like seeing that is extremely validating. I think, yeah, so that's a different flow. But anyways, so after that in 2022 the state started to roll out these age verification laws for adult websites. That means if I want to access adult content, I need to scan my driver's license and upload it to a website to prove that I'm an adult to consume this content. The other side, there's a lot of sides to this. Economically, for people that are making like queer porn houses that do have like, loyal followings, but they, have people that consume their goods, they have to shoulder the financial burden of holding on to this information. And then also it's just the idea that the government could audit that information and then have a list of everyone that has consumed this type of adult content, which I find deeply alarming. I don't think that should be happening. And again, I would say a lot of these, like Utah did it in 2023, Louisiana did it in 2022. They accessed in Utah, they banned Pornhub, and Louisiana really kicked off this like template for making all of these things, but there are many states now that you just can't access adult content because the cost is so great. Like Pornhub just won't do it per state, but it's getting to the point where there's so many states with these laws that they're kind of in a bind where they might have to start paying for it. But yeah, I think it's worth considering, who that actually affects. And then I referenced this earlier, but it was a Free Speech Coalition versus Paxton, which went up to the Supreme Court, and it was challenging the Texas law. And that was the age verification law. And that unfortunately went to the side of censorship. And now there's age verification laws are legal to pass in states and then also federally. Like we've kind of opened up the floodgates. I would also say a big thing with Free Speech Coalition versus Paxton is it opened up a door where there's actually a current lawsuit in Kansas, I believe. And it's a mom who is suing an adult entertainment company because her son found a laptop in the closet and then was accessing adult content, and she found that. And so these are the things that we're setting up. So it's much more nefarious than even the fear of like the digital security with your ID. It's opening up this door to censorship. And of course, the people behind these lawsuits are largely deeply religious, deeply puritanical people who don't want queer people to exist. I think that's just the reality. It's not even about the porn, it's not anything else. And so I see this also in tandem with all the laws about trans folks, and like, trying in Kansas, they also had all their licenses revoked that were
Their driver's licenses. Yeah.
Driver's license.
For folks who are not aware, in Kansas in the past couple of months, anybody who had changed the gender marker on their license, and it was an arduous process to change it in the first place. Like this is not, I mean, people should just be able to change things, I think, but like they had to go through multiple things, have letters from their doctors, go in, change their driver's license. If they had changed the gender marker at any point, they got a letter in the mail saying those licenses were invalid as of this moment, right? So it wasn't even like come in the next month and change it out, which is still problematic, but like they literally could not drive to the DMV or the SOS or whatever your state calls it to do that. Their licenses were right. So when we say attacking trans people, this is not a conceptual thing. Like we're dealing with policies that are working to erase trans folks from existence here.
Yeah. 100%. And I think you also see things like in Tennessee trying to make a public list of individuals that are trans. I mean, that is extremely alarming. I mean, then I know there are people more versed in it than I am, but I know talking to a lot of folks, I mean, it's like we're on the track, if not on the path to genocide in America for trans folks. And I don't mean to sound like alarmist.
It's not alarmist.
Yeah, I just think that's where we are. And so, and I see these things as all connected, right?
They are, of course.
Yeah. And one thing, and I'll get back to this. You can always cut this. But I'm really big on I don't believe, as somebody that's done a lot of work in like rural areas and with Republicans and across the aisle, whatever you want to say, I think this fantasy of like the acceptable queer is not actually real. And what I mean by that is like I run into a lot of people who are like, oh, it's like the kink at pride discourse, like, oh, we want to be acceptable and we need to be this way so they accept us. And usually it means like we need to be monogamous, we need to be white, we need to be men, usually. But I think I think there's like this logic of like if we put our head in the sand, it'll go away. If we're just like this, if we're just like them, they'll finally accept us. And I don't think that's true. And I think that it's time to really figure out how to like build community and solidarity. And I think a lot of like what I'm looking at and thinking about when I'm organizing events, when I'm doing things, are the work that was done during the AIDS epidemic and the AIDS crisis. And I think that we have to really figure out how to build solidarity and do rapid mutual aid. We did a big show and raised a bunch of money to, send to Kansas to a mutual aid fund that's just letting people pay for getting out of the state, pay for new licenses, because, it's like that thing of like today you, tomorrow me. So like we have to be in solidarity together. Is my only thing. But the thing currently is there's a bill called COSA, which is Kids Online Safety Act, and it's actually been they've been trying to do this since 2022, and it is a federal online safety bill, and it makes a bunch of different rules for us. And it makes it so basically there's a like liability to keep kids safe. And they talk a lot about, removing addictive features of social media, which there's no actual evidence science-wise behind how they're going to do that. And then also like blocking content. That's like, like eating disorder stuff of that nature. Which I think when we hear that, on its face sounds good. And I will say that like I have kids and I think like of course I don't want them to interact with like a lot of content online. My solution to that is not letting them online or having it be limited or monitoring what's happening online. And that is extra work and I understand it does come from a place of privilege, but I also feel like that is one of my jobs as a parent to do. And I know that can feel really harsh for people to hear. But as somebody that's dealt with Moms of Liberty a few times, it's like I want a good enough relationship with my kid that they can come to me when they've seen something. So like how are we creating a scenario where like if my kid sees something, they come to me and can say it. And I'm not a big like bootstrap person. I just think like this is inherently part of the deal with parenting, this is how we do it. And like kids accidentally finding porn has happened forever. Like this is not, that this is not new.
Playboy
Like
is under the bed,
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. We had like in the woods, there was like a weird stump that people would just leave magazines on. I don't know. Anyways, that's not the
Listen,
most
I was a
normal.
child of the 80s and 90s, and when, websites had that, like, click that you're 13 and able to
Oh yeah.
access this, or click that you're 18, like, no one was stopping this child from doing that,
Yeah.
right? Like, because I wanted to read erotica.
Yes. Yes. And so COSA doesn't do the age verification, but it's paired with a bill that's inside of it called COPA 2.0, which is from a long time ago, but they're updating it. And that would make it so federally that you have to do age verification requirements to enforce the under 16 protections. And like I've said, I have empathy for on its face, you hear a bill that's like Kids Online Safety Act, and you're like, of course, like I want kids to be safe online. I think the reality with a lot of these things is what it really involves, if we want to keep kids safe online, is good sex education that involves queer sex education, having open communication with your kids and being involved, and just a more open community to like sex positivity, queer positivity. Because, I think a big thing that I run into is like if you don't educate your kids, they will fill in those gaps. And so, you know, I I understand the fear behind like, oh, my kids could run into these things. But that is life in a lot of ways. And I think that also like again, this goes down to like parents' responsibility. Like if you don't want your kids online, although my kids are incredibly good at getting online, even if I'm not there. I mean, the schools give them laptops, there's things like that. But you can set in those settings and you can be there to kind of make that happen. And again, like one of the things when I think about COSA or any of these other bills that involve children is like we just need more education. How give some parent and children education on how to be safe online, you know?
Absolutely. Well, and I think that, same with Sesta Foster, right? Like, of course we want to stop sex trafficking,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Like, who's going to speak out against that, right? Like, why
Yeah.
would you not? And what we know from those is it actually drove most of the sex trafficking underground.
Yeah.
So taking things like
Yes.
Backpage off
Yep.
of, where people could advertise. It also shut down a lot of spaces where sex workers could check in with each other
Yeah.
about clients who were dangerous or violent.
Yep.
The people who were sex trafficking now have created more stuff on, quote, the dark web, but also non-online ways
Yeah.
where people connect. And so the sex trafficking has not gone down. We've had these huge consequences on sex worker. There's been more violence against sex workers, murder of sex workers that's happening. And then all of these unintended or perhaps intended consequences like we've seen with Tumblr, with Pornhub, with all of that. And so, with COSA, I'm thinking about what's been going on in Australia, where they passed a similar bill, which was no kids allowed online under the age of 16, I
Yeah.
believe. And what they found happened is either kids would start new accounts, they'd borrow
Yeah.
their parents' IDs, they started making fake IDs. And so, like, a section of kids are no longer using social media before the age of 16, but the vast majority of them have just quote, gone underground with it again. And so now you have less knowledge about where they're using online things, less knowledge of what content they're seeing. And we're pulling kids further away from adults because we're saying you have to hide what you're doing, right? Rather than having these open conversations about, hey, I saw this thing and it's kind of creeping me out, or I accidentally came across this very violent thing and I need some support around that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, 100%. Well, and I think too, and when you're talking about like pushing it out to more fringe and like worse areas is absolutely correct with porn. They also tried to do a ban in the UK, and then because they were using AI to enforce it, they would have people come on, like you'd have to like check, do like an age verification, and kids were just putting mustaches on and getting through it. So like that's the other thing.
Kids are so scrappy and I
That
love that for
Yep.
them.
I mean, if kids want to do something, it's almost like the Streisand effect. Like the more forbidden fruit you make it, the more they're going to want to do it. But I also think that, harboring, you know, places where they can be safe to talk about things is one of the most important things. And we need that with like more counselors in schools, with safer home life. And that's not the reality for a lot of people. And there still is a lot of shame around a lot of things with the body. And I think that both parents and kids would benefit more if this bill was calling for education on both sides. But unfortunately, that's a lot harder and it's less punitive. And we're in a very punitive society where it's like, we're just going to ban this thing. And it doesn't really work. It just pushes us to more and more extremes and puts us where we're at now, which is not a good place, in my opinion.
No, I agree. And I should note that we are filming this episode in early June. So, we take what we say next with a handful of salt about this bill specifically. But what I'm wondering is, with the increase in censorship that we're seeing, as you noted, at the state level, the federal level, I'd argue also the local level with school boards and what books are allowed in schools or not allowed in schools, what content can be shared by teachers. And that's also kind of trickling up to higher education as well. We've seen the shuttering of programs that talk about, people talk about critical race theory all the time, but no one is actually, not no one, very few people are actually teaching
Yeah.
critical race theory. It's a very
Yeah.
specific legal education
Yeah.
theory, right?
Yeah.
But because of the attack on talks about race, the attack on talks about stuff around sexuality and gender, we're seeing entire college centers shut down, entire departments close. Some liberal arts schools have, Hampshire College just completely shuttered almost overnight. So, for those of us that care about kink, queer education, sex education, trans issues, sex work communities, etc., what can we do to push back on what is happening right now in our country?
Well, that's a
And
great question.
worldwide, right? We also
Yeah,
noted UK and
worldwide. Yeah,
Australia.
there's
Yeah.
always yeah, it's if it's happening here, it's everywhere else. I will say that it can be really scary, but consider running for office. I know that I did. I'm actually wrapping up my 4-year term. I found there's other people that are progressive that are running, and I'm in Ann Arbor, so I'm extremely like we're good. But if you are in an area um, think about running. There are many different boards and things that you can do, but school boards, library boards, they really need your solidarity. They really need your support right now. They're underfunded. They need you, and we have to be the line of defense in that way. And if you can't run, show up to the meetings and support them, or just even telling them like, hey, you have an ally here. Like I'm willing to come speak out. And that's the other thing is like speak out, yes, there are some people like it'll be talking like to a wall, but one thing that really helped me when I was in early organizing is I met with a senator and I was like, I was in DC to have this meeting. And it was about gestational health. And so anyways, I was like, well, does it matter that we're here? And they were like, yeah, it does. Cause my mental calculation is if you send me an email, um, 10 of my constituents agree with you. If you call me, it's 100. If you visit my satellite office, it's 1,000. And if you fly to DC to have a personal meeting with me about this, it's probably like more like 10,000. So I think knowing that mental math going into these things is really important. And it can feel really fruitless, but I have seen the little like chalkboard in there where it's like we got 300 calls about this thing. Like there are people in those offices tracking that stuff. If you live in a red district, it can be really scary to run, but I think you should run anyways or consider it. And then, keeping up, ACLU is always good on issues and doing things like that. Electronic Frontier Foundation, top notch. They do great stuff. They attack it
And
from
we'll
like,
have links to all of this.
yeah,
So click them and
yeah.
start following them.
Yeah. And Electronic Frontier Foundation does a lot of good rapid response. So like setting things out that people can just quickly do. Supporting Free Speech Coalition, also always great. They're just really doing the work out there. And they're always like teams of like 10 people, and I have nothing but endless respect for them. And then also I would just give a shout out for mutual aid and just trying to build community, right? Because it can feel so scary and isolating right now, to feel like you're the only one maybe reading this, or whatever it is. So even if it's like, like we do softcore social, which is like a big fun drag show, but you can do things like I know Detroit has like a queers eating garlic bread on Belle Isle. Like you can do anything to do it. And I think those pockets of joy right now are so important and so restorative, because queer joy will exist forever. It doesn't matter what they do. It's always going to be there because we'll be there. And they cannot take that from us. And I think that's just a really important restorative part. And it's the part that makes me want to get up and do the phone calls and do the events and organize to do this. And if you want to organize and do the kinky, weird, queer thing, do it now. Like we got to be out. We got to be who we are. I am who I am radically without apology anymore. I spent a long time kind of tipping toeing around who I was, and not anymore. So be out and be loud.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And when we say mutual aid, I think a lot of people only think about giving dollars, which is the number one and most important thing. And even if it is $5, people are posting all the time, queer and trans folks, folks of the global majority, immigrants, disabled folks, someone will post, drop $5 their way. If you can drop 500, amazing. And it is also things like skill shares. It is things like I do a queer and trans disabled neurodivergent COVID cautious dinner once a month, and I just cook a vegan gluten-free thing, and anybody's welcome to show up and eat. And we talk about things like censorship or community organizing or what's going on or how to garden. We did a skill share around, planting things, and everybody left with some plants. And so whatever it is that you're good at, find community around that. You don't and similarly with engaging with officials, there are many ways. So like if the phone is too much for you, start with an email.
Yep.
If going to an office is too much for you, can you go with a group of people? Look for lobby days, look for all of these things, because you're certainly not on your own. And I think people really discount how impactful engaging with their elected officials can be. So sorry, I'm like, yes, all of this. So
No.
into that.
Well, and I just also want to shout out my mindset has always been that they work for me. And I think that's like more people need to step into that energy. Like you are their boss. You elect them. You put them in that seat. Maybe you didn't vote for them, but like your other folks did, and they don't know. They don't know who voted for, unless you're like, I did not vote for you. And that's on you a little bit. But I think it's important to like remember that you do have that power. And I always think of it as like they're public servants and they need to act like public servants. So, yeah.
Yeah, great. We do have a question from a listener.
Oh.
So she would like to know how someone who's not part of kink or non-monogamous community, but is really interested in supporting the activism of these communities, should approach these communities to learn more and get involved.
Yeah, I mean, I think curiosity is always good. I think that supporting the orgs that we talked about earlier is always good. And then, just look at the art. I think art is like a really good way to explore these different things. And I think that like one of the reasons for the film festival and for the magazine is to highlight like queer, trans, poly art and to have those discussions. There's a really great piece from May Howard that we're going to have in the magazine, and it's Crip Gimp. It's a series. You can look it up, and it's fantastic. And it just explores like disability and all these things. And but you interact with this art, and it kind of helps you like think through these things. And buy art and things from people. And I think that also just when it comes to non-monogamy, I would say my biggest piece of advice is just keep an open mind. Feel free to ask questions for people that that might be willing to answer them. I think that for myself, my journey into non-monogamy, I think I always was poly. I see it as more of like a part of who I am. But it was a lot of like reading and talking to people and understanding myself, right? The journey, in my mind, a lot of the work in polyamory is work on the self first. It's not necessarily a couple experience. It's working with yourself. And I think we all could benefit from a lot of that, whether it's in the lens of polyamory or not. But exploring the self is always a plus and worth doing. So,
Absolutely. I think, one of the places I send people who want to talk about non-monogamy is, of course, there's the older Polyamory Weekly podcast. There's the new Multiamory podcast. Multiamory has a really great episode with Kim Tallbear, who talks about non-monogamy and polyamory as like decolonizing this idea of relationships and what it's supposed to look like, because the idea of monogamy comes from Christianity and colonization and capitalism, right? Like we want two people to buy one house on their own. Everybody buys their own house. Everybody does this separately. It all, Christianity, this like one of each, all of that, right? So like if you are truly saying like I want to decolonize my mind, right? And I would also argue you can't do decolonization without land back. So like let's name that first. Like we have to give land back to Indigenous folks. Um, but decolonizing of the mind also includes things like decolonizing the idea of monogamy being the one true way. I'd also say classes, right? You talked about learning is, oftentimes there are kink classes or classes on non-monogamy that are open to the community. And
yep.
that's a great way to go in, and because people will then talk about like, hey, we need somebody to show up at the senator's office, or we're having a mutual aid fundraiser for this person. So
Yeah.
I think, of course, what you said, and then,
Yeah. Yeah. A call 83. I teach latex 101 at a call 83. Anyone's welcome. So, but yeah, yeah, I would also say like with polyamory, I think a really interesting thing to think about. One thing that I run into a lot is people like, I couldn't do it because I'm so jealous. And one thing that I always like to ask people is like, well, have you ever thought about unpacking your jealousy? What would your life be like if you can explore what that means? Because usually to me, it's jealousy is usually an unmet need, but it took a long time to understand that for myself. Um, and I think like the gift of polyamory for me has been that like I can explore those things and like figure out what my needs are. And I think in how I practice monogamy, my needs weren't apart. And
Mm.
so I think that that is just in itself really freeing. So just like thinking about the world a little differently, or maybe even just the concept of, do you hold your friendships in the same regard as your partnerships? And what would it look like if you gave yourself that time? Because I know my friendships are very restorative. So just entertaining the idea of what does that look like and mean?
I love that. And maybe we'll have you on to talk about the original version of relationship anarchy at a later date.
Yeah.
Also, I don't know if people can hear my cat purring. She is so loud, and I'm just wondering if it's being picked up. But if you hear a motor in the background, that is Ember, my familiar. So we are going to wind up today. We have two more questions for you. What is one takeaway? You've given so many nuggets of wisdom, but what's one takeaway that you want everyone listening to know after they've heard you today?
If you're going to be a pervert, now is when to do it. I'm kidding, but be loud and be who you are and take up space. We need you in this. And we need you, and we need you to take up space. We need you to work with us, and we need to do things loud while we can, while we're here. And we will get through this. But we're going to have to take up a lot of space and have a lot of fights, but it'll be worth it someday. And, please be with us in this.
Hmm. So, with all that is going on, I mean, I think we've heard many things that you are doing for this, but what's one way that you're centering joy right now in your life?
Well, I think I'm spending a lot of time building joy in the queer community, whether it's doing things like I'm going to MIR, was formerly Mr. International Rubber, and I'm going to compete for one of the titles. So I'm really excited about that. Yes, we
That's so exciting.
yes, excited. So that'll be in November. But like working with some of my wonderful friends that we do the burlesque and drag stuff together to do a performance and just really immersing myself in queer art and having these conversations, and doing a lot of dancing and eating a lot of good food. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Where can people find out more about you and the work you're doing?
Yes, you can go to restrictfilm.com. That has the magazine and the film fest. The film fest is going to be October 3rd at Planet Ant, and we'll have tickets live soon. And then the magazine as soon as I can. I'm working on it. But all the information is there. We are really trying to build out our email list because we are getting censored online. It's been kind of a problem. But if you want to find me on Instagram, it's at restrictfilm on Instagram, and that's where you can find me.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time and excellent conversation today, Kat. I'm sure we could have talked for another hour or two. We'll definitely have to have you back on. Thank you, gentle listeners, for engaging with the Surge Ahead podcast as we work to bring our research, practice, and pedagogy to life during these trying times. Visit srgcollective.com for this and other episodes, as well as to learn more about the work we're currently doing. You can also find us on LinkedIn and BlueSky, where you can ask questions of myself and or our guests, suggest future topics, and find other ways to engage with us. Together, we can build the world that we all deserve. Remember, we take care of us. I'm Dr. Shanna Katz, signing off.